Hello, and welcome to tonight's journey, a story that is distant, slow, and ancient, beginning in a world about 375 million years away from us. Before we move deeper into the shallow waters of the Devonian period, try letting me know in the comments, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? Perhaps you are in a quiet room at the end of the day, in a small corner beside a window, on a night journey, or simply lying in your familiar bed after a long day. Now, let everything around you slow down for a moment. Relax your shoulders, take a gentle breath in, and let the breath flow out naturally. Tonight, we will leave the modern world behind. We will leave behind the lights, the streets, the sounds of machines, and travel backward to a very different Earth. Back then, there were no humans, no birds crossed the sky, no mammals ran through the forests. The land was still a strange frontier, beginning to turn green with primitive plants, but not yet truly belonging to vertebrate animals. At the edge of those shallow waters, where soft mud quietly preserved the traces of time, there lay a creature between two worlds. It had scales, fins, and gills like a fish. But hidden within that body were strange signs: a neck that could move, fins strong enough to support weight, and a bone structure that hinted at the wrists of creatures that would walk much later. Its name was Tiktaalik, and its story is not the story of a fish that suddenly crawled onto land. It is the story of the moment life began to learn how to carry its own body, very slowly, very silently, at the boundary between water and land. Imagine that we are drifting backward into a time so distant that the human mind can hardly grasp it in full. Not 1,000 years, not 10,000 years, not even the age of the pyramids, the first cities, or the giant beasts of the Ice Age. We are leaving behind all of human history, leaving even the dinosaurs behind, leaving the familiar forests behind, to return to an Earth about 375 million years from the present, an Earth of the Devonian period, where life had already existed for a very long time. But the world upon the land still felt like a room whose door had only just been opened, vast, silent, and not yet truly possessed by any master. If you were standing there on an ancient morning, you would not hear birdsong. There would be no sound of animals running through the grass, no humming chorus of insects like in a modern summer forest. The sky might be bright, the wind might move across the lowlands, the water might glimmer beneath the sunlight, but the overall feeling would still be one of strange emptiness. The land was no longer completely lifeless as it had been in earlier ages. Primitive plants had begun to spread across the regions near water. Ancient trunks, low-growing plants. Strange patches of green were clinging to mud, to stone, to riverbanks that were not yet stable. But that world was not yet a forest filled with the voices of animals. It was like a stage being built very slowly, where the backdrop had appeared. The lights had come on, but the great characters had not yet stepped out. The Devonian period is often called the Age of Fishes, and that name is no accident. In the water, life was flourishing in a way far more powerful than it was on land. Beneath rivers, estuaries, coastal swamps, and shallow seas, fish were everywhere. There were fish armored in hard plates of bone, their bodies like living shields gliding silently over the bottom. There were predators with powerful jaws, hiding in murky water, waiting for the chance to strike. There were smaller species moving like dim shadows, slipping through aquatic plants and shallow pools. If the land at that time still seemed quiet, then beneath the water was a world full of movement, competition, pursuit, and survival. But that abundance also created pressure. When a world becomes crowded, every living thing must find a way to live better in its own place. Some species moved into deeper waters. Some hid in the mud. Some took advantage of shallow water, where light reached more easily, where prey could become trapped, where the current sometimes withdrew and left behind warm, cloudy pools. Those places were not exactly land, but they were no longer quite like the depths of the sea. They were boundaries. And in the history of life, boundaries are always the strangest places. At a boundary, the body must change. Habits must change. Breathing, seeing, supporting oneself, moving. All are tested, little by little. Now, lower yourself closer, as though you are standing at the edge of an ancient Devonian river. The water is not clear blue like in a painting. It may be cloudy, heavy with silt, still in some places and rushing in others. The riverbank is not held firmly by large tree roots, as in many modern landscapes. Everything is still young, easily collapsed, easily redirected. Rainstorms can make the water rise, and when it recedes, they leave behind wide mudflats, shallow pools, and wet patches of earth shining under the sun. In those pools, life is placed into a very different situation. The water is still there, but it is no longer deep enough for every body to float lightly. The mud supports part of the body, the water supports part of it, and the rest begins to face gravity. Gravity is something we often forget, because from the moment we are born, our bodies are used to it, our bones bear it, our muscles work with it, our feet touch the ground without our needing to think very much. But for a body born for water, gravity is an entirely different matter. In water, the body is lifted. A fin can push, steer, and keep balance. The spine does not have to carry the full weight in the way that a body on land must. But when the water gradually grows shallower, when the belly touches mud, when the head needs to lift, when the front of the body must rise from the bottom in order to turn or snap at prey, everything becomes more difficult. A body that only knows how to swim will feel itself being pulled downward. A thin fin made only to fan through water will not be enough to survive in shallow water. The body needs a different kind of strength. The important thing is that no creature in the Devonian period sat there and decided that it would evolve in order to climb onto land. Life does not follow a plan written in advance. There was no distant goal hanging before those ancient fish, telling them that one day their descendants would run across grasslands, climb trees, fly through the sky, or sit and tell stories in the night. Everything began closer, simpler, more practical. A shallow pool, a prey animal in front, a predator behind, a sunken log blocking the way, a body needing to prop itself up slightly to turn direction, a head needing to rise above murky water to see, to breathe, to live one more day. On land, meanwhile, plants were quietly doing something immense. They did not walk, did not hunt, did not roar in the darkness, but they were changing the planet. Primitive plants began to hold the soil, create shade, alter the flow of water, and contribute to the creation of new environments along rivers and swamps. A land with plants, though still very different from a modern forest, was already a different land from bare stone. Leaves fell, trunks decayed, roots clung, mud accumulated, and water was held in hollows. Little by little, the land became more complex, and when the environment becomes more complex, life gains more places to experiment. But the land was still a dangerous place. It had potential food, open space, and small bodies of water with fewer large predators. But it also came with a heavy cost. Leaving water meant the body could dry out. Fish gills, wonderful in water, no longer worked in the familiar way in air. Skin, eyes, eggs, reproduction, movement, everything had to face new limits. Just imagine a soft, wet creature lying too long under the sun, and you will feel that the land was not an easy promised land. It was an opportunity, but also a harsh trial. For that reason, the transition from water to land could not have been a simple moment. It had to be a long chain of small changes, occurring over countless generations, in places half water and half land, where danger and opportunity lay side by side. And here, the story begins to deepen, because before there was a true foot placed upon the earth, there may have been fins already doing more than swimming. Before there was an animal walking on land, there may have been bodies propping themselves up on the bottom of the water. Before there was a neck as we understand it today, there may have been heads beginning to separate from rigid shoulders, allowing them to turn more lightly, see better, and hunt more effectively in shallow water. Those changes did not originally need to serve life on land. They only needed to help a creature live better in the world immediately before it. But later, those very features could become the foundation for an entirely new way of life. Let the scene slow down for a moment. The Devonian sun hangs over a broad, damp land. Ancient plants cast their shadows into the water. The river splits into many small channels, some deep, some shallow, some with only soft mud beneath a thin layer of water. Beneath the surface, the shadows of fish pass by. Some are fast and small, some are heavy, armored, some lie still near the bottom, almost blending into the color of the mud. Every movement is slow, yet tense. A single sweep of the tail can cloud an entire patch of water. A snap of the jaws can end a small life. An isolated pool can become a refuge, or a trap, depending on rain, sun, and luck. In that world, the land was not a clear boundary in the way we often imagine. There was no line saying that this side was water and that side was land. There was mud, there were primitive reeds, there were roots, there were marshy places, there were stretches of water just deep enough to cover a body. There were times when floods spread across the ground, turning land into river. There were times when the water receded, turning the riverbed into a mudflat. It was this constant change that forced creatures living near the water's edge to become more flexible. A body suited to only one condition could easily be left behind, but a body able to tolerate slightly shallower water, support itself slightly better, turn slightly more easily, could survive longer, eat more, and avoid danger more effectively. This is why the story of the first step should not be imagined as a romantic adventure, where a brave fish crawled onto the sand to explore the world. The truth was probably quieter, but also far more beautiful. It did not begin with courage. It began with suitability. A fin a little stronger, a joint a little more flexible, a front body that could lift itself for a shorter moment, a head that could turn without turning the entire body. These things did not immediately make a creature a resident of the land, but they made it different, and over an immense length of time. Small differences can open large paths. In the Devonian period, life was like something standing before a door, though the door had not yet fully opened. Behind it lay the entire history of land animals, the first amphibians, ancient reptiles, forests filled with insects, giant dinosaurs, small mammals living in shadow, and eventually, human beings. But at this moment, all of that still lay ahead. There were no human footprints, no sound of horse hooves, no hands holding fire, no eyes looking up at the night sky and asking questions about their origins. There was only water, mud, primitive plants, and ancient bodies trying to live in an unstable frontier. If you listen closely in your imagination, you can feel that the Devonian world was not completely silent. There was the sound of water gently touching a muddy bank, the sound of wind passing through low plant stems, the sound of a heavy body sliding beneath the surface, the sound of mud being stirred when a creature turned inside a shallow pool. But this was not the noise of a completed world. It was the sound of a world preparing, a world that did not yet know what it was about to become. A world in which every river, every swamp, every mud flat could be the place where a new possibility was tested. And then, within that landscape, the great question of the journey begins to appear. If the land at this time did not yet truly belong to vertebrate animals, what caused some bodies beneath the water to begin carrying features useful for life near the shore? Why would a creature living in water need to prop itself up? Why was shallow water so important? And how? From fins used for swimming. Did the history of life eventually lead to limbs that could lift, push, crawl, walk, run, and touch? The first chapter of this story does not have a single character. It is the chapter of an entire world, a world turning green very slowly, a world where fish ruled the waterways, while the land still waited in its wildness, a world where life had not yet fully stepped out of the water, but had begun to draw closer to the shore. And it was there, at the edge of the water, where mud and water blended together, where boundaries were unclear, where every creature was simply trying to live one more day. That history quietly prepared for one of the most important changes ever to occur on this planet. Because before there could be a first step, there had to be a world complex enough to call that step into being. Before there could be an animal truly living on land, there had to be shallow waters, mudflats, survival pressures, and bodies beginning to change. And before we meet the name Tiktaalik in the ancient rocks of the Arctic, we need to see the Devonian period as it once was. Not merely a distant era in a science book, but a very long dawn of the land. When the ground did not yet belong to animals, but life had already begun to hear the call from the shore. In the far north of Canada, there is a place where the ground seems to have been reduced to nothing but stone, wind, and silence. On Ellesmere Island, the sky often stretches out with a chilling vastness, pale light falling across empty slopes of rock, and every sound swallowed by the immense open space. There, a person could walk for a very long time without seeing any sign of a world that was once warm, humid, full of rivers and life. There are only layers of stone stacked upon one another, cold gray and motionless, as if they had never known the sound of flowing water, soft mud, or the shadows of ancient creatures gliding beneath the surface. But stone does not forget as easily as we imagine, beneath that hard and frozen exterior. Ellesmere Island still preserves the memory of another Earth, an Earth about 375 million years away from us. The place that today is a desolate Arctic region once belonged to a completely different environment. Shallow waters, mudflats, river edges, where life was beginning to move closer to the boundary between water and land. And it was precisely in the place that seemed farthest from that story that paleontologists went searching for a creature they believed must once have existed. Not quite a fish as we usually imagine it, but not yet an animal walking on land. It was a creature lying between two worlds, and to find it. Human beings first had to learn how to listen to the Arctic rocks for a very long time. Today, if we look at that land, it is very difficult to imagine that this place was once part of a warmer world. Layers of rock lie still beneath a frozen sky. There is no Devonian forest before our eyes, no shallow stream filled with soft mud flowing through it, no shadows of ancient fish gliding beneath the water's surface. There are only old stones, empty slopes, surfaces worn down by wind and time, and a silence so long that it almost seems not to belong to human life. Yet that very silence holds a secret in those layers of rock. Time has not disappeared. It has only been pressed down, compressed, waiting for someone patient enough to read the very old pages of the earth. The search for Tiktaalik did not begin as a simple story of luck. It was not the kind of story in which someone happens to walk by, accidentally kicks a strange piece of bone, and changes the history of science. It began with a question. If vertebrate animals had once moved gradually from water toward land, if bodies with fins had slowly developed features closer to the limbs of four-limbed animals, then somewhere in ancient rocks, there had to be traces of intermediate forms. Not necessarily a missing link, in the simple sense, not a creature standing upright halfway between fish and beast, but a form of life carrying within itself features of both worlds. A body that still belonged to water, but had begun to reveal new possibilities. Paleontologists did not search for it with pure imagination. They searched with geological maps, with the age of rocks, with knowledge of ancient environments, and with the gaps in the fossil record. They knew that if they wanted to find a creature living near the boundary between lobe-finned fish and early four-limbed animals, they needed rock layers of the right age, not too young, because by then animals with clear limbs had already appeared, not too old, because those features may not yet have formed. They needed a place that had once been a river, swamp, shallow water environment, or delta, where a half-water, half-shoreline creature might once have lived, and they needed exposed rock, enough of it, clear enough, for human eyes to search through the cliffs opened by time. That is why the Arctic was not as strange a choice as it might seem. On a modern map, Ellesmere Island lies in the polar region, remote, cold, almost at the edge of the human world. But stone does not tell only the story of its present location. Stone tells the story of drifting continents, changing climates, and lands that once lay elsewhere in the deep past, about 375 million years ago. This land was not the icy Arctic we see today. It belonged to an ancient, warmer world, with river systems and shallow waters, where sediments could bury the bodies of living creatures and preserve them across hundreds of millions of years. Imagine a small expedition in that cold expanse. They were not walking into a clean museum, where fossils had already been placed behind glass. They were walking into an open landscape of rock, where every day was a mixture of science, patience, and endurance. To find a piece of bone in ancient stone, human beings have to learn how to look differently. A rock is not just a rock. A small curve exposed on the surface may be a sign of bone. An unusual patch of color may be a scale. A raised mark in the sediment may be the remains of a body that once lived, once swam, once breathed, once hunted in a river that had vanished long before dinosaurs ever appeared. The work was slow, almost meditative, walking over stone, bending down, looking, tapping lightly, observing, turning over a piece of rock, checking the surface, then moving on again. An entire day might pass without finding anything important. Many seasons might go by collecting only small fragments. signs not yet clear enough, hopes tested by weather and distance, in a place so remote. Every expedition was difficult. Time in the field was limited. Natural conditions were harsh. Every piece of equipment, every supply, every tool, every specimen had to be carefully planned. One could not simply stay longer because one wished to. One could not simply dig deeper forever. Nature in that place always reminded human beings that science, at times, also requires a very quiet kind of perseverance. And then, on an expedition like that, among the Devonian rocks of Ellesmere Island, part of the secret began to reveal itself. The entire creature did not appear at once like a complete statue. Fossils rarely open themselves so easily. It appeared piece by piece, sign by sign, in patches of bone held tightly by stone, but to eyes accustomed to reading the language of ancient bones, a shape began to take on meaning. This did not look like an ordinary fish. It was not yet a true four-limbed animal either. It lay between them in a strange and precious way. That very in-between quality made the moment of discovery so special. We can imagine that feeling carefully, without inventing specific words or emotions. After years of searching, after expeditions through cold stone landscapes, after choosing the right age of rock, the right environment, the right geological region, a creature began to step out of silence, not stepping out with feet, not stepping out of the water, but stepping out of stone, a flattened head, signs of a large body, bones that made people look again, a creature from the Devonian period, lying still for 375 million years, finally touched by modern light. Its name would later be given as Tiktaalik rosei. Tiktaalik is a word from Inuktitut, often explained as referring to a large freshwater fish. There is a beautiful simplicity in that name. It does not sound like a cold technical term. It connects the scientific discovery to the land where the fossil was found, to the language and the modern Arctic space around it, in that name. There is a feeling that an ancient creature was being called back not only by the laboratory, but also by the very land that had held it in stone through hundreds of millions of years. But Tiktaalik did not immediately become a famous story simply because it was old. There are many ancient fossils. What made it special was its place in a larger story. When scientists looked closely at that body, they saw a rare mixture. It was still a fish, with the features of a fish, but it also carried signs that made people think of early four-limbed animals. It was like a photograph taken at exactly the right moment, not when life had fully moved onto land, and not when it was still completely confined to deep water. It belonged to the transitional zone, the boundary zone, the very region we stepped into in our imagination in the previous chapter. Here, we need to understand the phrase half fish, half beast as an image, not as a literal statement. Tiktaalik was not a beast. It had no fur, did not run on land, and did not live like a mammal or a reptile that would come later. It was an ancient lobe-finned fish, but when we look at it, we see features that make it no longer fit the ordinary image of a fish. That is why, in the language of storytelling, it seems like a creature standing between two worlds, one half still submerged in ancient water, the other half seemingly foreshadowing the bodies that would one day support themselves on land. What makes Tiktaalik so captivating is not that it was perfectly halfway, in a simple sense, but that it shows how evolution can assemble great changes from small details, across a span of time so long that no individual life could ever perceive it. After being taken out of the rock, the fossil did not end its story in the field. A second journey began in the laboratory, if in the Arctic. Human beings had to struggle against wind, cold, and distance. Then in the research room, they had to struggle against hard stone. the fragility of bone, and every millimeter that had to be cleaned without destroying information. A fossil is not a decoration. It is an ancient text written in minerals. Every line of bone, every joint, every patch of scale can be a letter in the story of evolution. Cleaning too forcefully can erase evidence. Reading too quickly can lead to misunderstanding. And so patience continued. This time beneath laboratory lights, with magnifying lenses, delicate tools, photographs, drawings, and anatomical comparisons. When the discovery was announced, Tiktaalik quickly became one of the most famous fossils in the story of fish moving toward land. But that fame also easily created misunderstanding. People like simple stories. A fish crawls onto land, and everything begins. But science is rarely that simple. Tiktaalik is not evidence for a single moment when life suddenly left the water. It is evidence for a process with many branches, many species, many experiments, many failures, and many different directions. Tiktaalik matters because it helps illuminate a dark gap, not because it alone explains everything. And perhaps that is what makes the search through Arctic stone even more beautiful. The scientists were not looking for a myth. They were looking for a possibility that ancient rocks could either confirm or deny. They predicted that in the right age of rock, in the right environment, there could exist a creature carrying intermediate features, and then, in a remote land that seemed to hold nothing but cold and silence, a fossil appeared, almost as if answering from the past. Yes, bodies like this once existed. Yes, life once experimented at the water's edge. Yes, the story of the first step did not begin on a radiant shore, but deep in layers of sediment, in ancient rivers, later found again in stone. Pause for a moment before that image. On one side is the modern Arctic, cold, distant, harsh, where human beings must wear warm clothing, set up camp, and travel through rock and wind to search. On the other side is the ancient Devonian world, warmer, wetter, with shallow water, soft mud, and strange creatures living at the boundary between two environments. The two worlds are separated by 375 million years, yet they are connected by a skeleton lying in stone. That is the special power of fossils. They do not merely tell us that a creature once existed, they allow two ages to touch. In this story, stone is like a box of memory. It does not preserve the sound of flowing water. It does not preserve the true color of the Devonian sky. It does not preserve the final breath of that creature, or the small movements it made in shallow water, but it preserves enough for us to ask questions, enough for us to see a shape, enough for us to recognize that living bodies do not always fit neatly into familiar boxes such as fish and land animal. There are moments in history when life lies in between, not lost, but adapting, not unfinished, but suited to a very particular world of its own. And from this point, Tiktaalik begins to become the central character of the journey, not as an ancient monster, not as a hero stepping out of the sea, but as a rare trace, an ordinary creature in its own time yet extraordinary in our eyes. Because its body preserves clues to one of the greatest turning points in the history of life on Earth. It lay in Arctic stone like a very slow answer to questions that human beings only began to ask hundreds of millions of years later. But for now, we do not yet need to open its entire body. We do not yet need to go deeply into its special fin, its neck, or the joints that made Tiktaalik famous. That will come later. In this chapter, what matters more is feeling the journey of finding it, from a scientific question, through geological maps, to expeditions in a remote place, And finally, to the moment ancient stone revealed a creature that once lived at the boundary between water and land. Because sometimes, a great discovery does not begin with a shout of triumph. It begins with someone bending down before a layer of rock, with a gaze that notices something unusual, with patience carried across many seasons of research, with the belief that the earth, if read in the right way, is still telling its story. And in that story, Tiktaalik is a very thin but very bright page, a page lying between the chapter of fish and the chapter of the first steps. When night falls in our imagination, the Arctic rocks return to their silence, the wind still passes over the empty slopes, the layers of stone still lie as they have lain through countless centuries. But since Tiktaalik was found, that silence is no longer completely empty. We know that beneath that cold surface, the memory of an ancient watery world was once hidden. We know that stone can hold stories greater than any footprint on the ground. And we know that sometimes, to understand a very distant step in the history of life, human beings must begin by listening to a single stone for a very long time. In the next chapter, when that layer of stone is opened a little further, we will begin to look more closely at the body of Tiktaalik itself. Then the question will no longer be only, where was it found? It will become, what was it in the body of a 375-million-year-old fish that allowed scientists to see the shadow of creatures that would walk much later? As the ancient rock is opened little by little, Tiktaalik does not appear in the imagination as a complete animal from the very beginning. It does not step out of the past with a clear shape, does not immediately reveal its entire body to us like a reconstruction painting. It appears through pieces of bone, through curves, through fossilized surfaces, through tiny details that must be studied for a long time before they begin to carry meaning. Yet from those very details, a strange body gradually emerges, a body that still belonged to water, yet gave people the feeling that it was carrying within itself a secret of the land. First of all, Tiktaalik was still a fish. This needs to be said very clearly, because the image of a fish with wrists can easily lead the listener's imagination too far. It was not an ancient beast. It did not have true legs. It had no feet, no toes, no claws, no fur, and no breath of an animal living on land. Its body had scales. It had fins. It had the signs of a creature born in water, raised in water, and still deeply dependent on the world of water, at a glance, in a muddy, shallow Devonian river. We might still call it a fish, but if we look longer, if we let our eyes rest on the head, the shoulders, and the front fins, we begin to understand why Tiktaalik drew the attention of scientists so strongly. The head of Tiktaalik was not like the familiar fish head many people imagine. It was flat, broad, and low, suggesting the head of a predator lying close to the bottom rather than a fish swimming freely through deep water. Its two eyes sat higher, facing upward, as though that body often stayed near the bottom while its gaze turned toward the surface, toward the space above, or toward movements at the edge of its environment. That shape did not turn Tiktaalik into a crocodile. But it helps us understand why many people have compared its head to an image very different from that of an ordinary fish. Wide, flat, silent, waiting. But the stranger feature lay in the neck, in most fish. The head and shoulders are almost tightly joined into a rigid structure. When a fish wants to change the direction of its gaze or mouth, the whole body usually has to take part in the movement. Tiktaalik was different. In its body, the shoulder region was no longer attached tightly to the skull in the familiar way seen in more ancient fish. This allowed the head a degree of movement of its own, a kind of early neck. It sounds simple, but in the history of animal bodies, this was a major change. when the head can move more independently from the body. A creature can turn, lift, observe, and strike in ways it could not before. A neck is not merely a connection, it is a new way for the body to interact with the world. Imagine Tiktaalik lying low in shallow water, its body almost blending into the color of the mud, its eyes turned upward, its head able to shift slightly without the entire body turning along with it. There is no need to turn this scene into a violent hunt. Just one very small movement is enough to show the meaning of this structure. In a shallow environment full of obstacles, where mud, fallen trunks, ancient roots, and slow-moving water created narrow spaces, flexibility could be an advantage. The body no longer had to turn its entire heavy mass every time. The head could do its own work, and from a detail that seems so small, we see life experimenting with a new kind of body. Then come the ribs. In many fish, ribs do not need to perform the task of supporting the body in the way they do in land animals. Water has already lifted much of that weight, but in Tiktaalik, the ribs were stronger, more pronounced, as if the body needed a firmer internal frame in certain situations. This does not mean that it walked like an animal on land, but it does show that this body did not merely float lightly in deep water. It may have been accustomed to shallower places, where the body sometimes had to endure more pressure from its own weight, where the front of the body needed to be more stable, sturdier, more secure. And then we arrive at the most famous detail, Tiktaalik's pectoral fin. This is the feature that made it one of the most frequently mentioned fossils in the story of the origin of four-limbed animals. Because within that fin, scientists saw something both familiar and strange. On the outside, it was still a fin. It was not a hand. It did not have fingers spreading out to grip the ground. It still bore the marks of an organ used in water. But inside, the skeleton of that fin had parts that recalled the structure of the forelimb in four-limbed animals, a large bone close to the body, followed by bones corresponding to the forearm region, then smaller joints farther out, forming a kind of early wrist-like structure. When we hear the word wrist, we need to understand that it is a way of helping us imagine, not a fully formed human wrist. Tiktaalik did not have hands like ours. It also did not have long digits touching the mud like a modern salamander. But its fin was not simply a soft paddle for fanning water. It had strong bones, joints, and the ability to bend and support in a way that led scientists to think the front of its body could be lifted or pushed upward in certain postures. Put more gently, that fin did not only help Tiktaalik swim, it could help the body brace itself against the bottom. This is the point that makes the story feel so wondrous. A fin, in ordinary imagination, belongs to the soft movement of water. It flicks, glides, pushes, steers. A leg, by contrast, belongs to weight, ground, and support. But in Tiktaalik, that boundary is no longer clear. The fin was still a fin, yet it had begun to do part of the work that we would later associate with a limb. It did not turn Tiktaalik into a walking animal, but it shows that some components of body support had appeared before true feet were born, and that makes the fin feel like a very ancient draft of an idea that life would continue to revise for millions of years afterward. Let this image move slowly through your mind. A long body lying in shallow water, a flat head, high-set eyes, a body covered in scales, two pectoral fins placed at the front, not merely drifting in the current, but perhaps pressing down into the mud or the riverbed, when the head needed to lift, when the body needed to adjust its position, when it needed to brace itself in water too shallow for free swimming. Those fins could become points of support, not footsteps, not hands, but a kind of bracing, a very humble, very small moment. Yet in the long history of vertebrate animals, It carried great meaning. What makes Tiktaalik special is that it does not fit neatly into a familiar box. If we look only at its fish-like features, we can say, this is a fish. If we look at the features closer to four-limbed animals, we see something that reaches beyond the ordinary image of fish. But the more beautiful truth lies in the fact that it was both. In a deep evolutionary sense, not half this and half that, like an imaginary creature, but a real body made of old and new features existing together. Evolution does not erase the old to build the new from nothing. It revises, it preserves, it changes function. It takes a structure that once served one purpose and gradually allows that structure to do something else. Tiktaalik's fin is a beautiful example of that. Before there were forelimbs of four-limbed animals, there were fins with bones inside them. Before there was a clear wrist, there were joints hidden deep within a fin. Before there was a hand placed upon the ground, there were bodies that needed to brace themselves against the bottom of the water. Not everything appeared at once. It was not that one day a fin magically became a leg. Instead, across countless generations, small structures were adjusted, selected, and used in new circumstances. And when we look at Tiktaalik, we do not see magic. We see a process. In storytelling, Tiktaalik is often called a half-fish, half-beast creature. That phrase has power. But we should keep it as an image, not as a strict scientific conclusion. Tiktaalik was not a beast. It was also not yet a true four-limbed animal. But it helps us understand that there were stages in the history of life when features we now separate into fish-like and land animal-like once existed together in the same body. It is like an answer written in bone to the question, how could a body that swam in water gradually move toward the ability to support itself? The more closely we look, the more we see that Tiktaalik is not interesting because of one single body part, not only because it had wrists, not only because it had a neck, not only because its head was flat or its ribs were strong. What makes it important is the combination. A single feature may be curious, but when many features appear together at the right time, in the right environment, in the right position among other forms of life, they begin to tell a larger story. Tiktaalik's body is like a small map, where each region of bone points in a direction, from swimming toward support, from a head fixed tightly to a flexible neck, from a body lifted by water to a body needing greater stability in the shallows. And in that story, we also see a gentle lesson in how science looks at the past. Scientists do not need Tiktaalik to be the first in order for it to be important. A fossil does not have to stand at the front of the line to have value. The value of Tiktaalik lies in the fact that it was preserved well enough to show us rare details of a stage that is very difficult to capture. Most creatures that ever lived left no fossils. Most fossils are never found. Most of what is found is not complete enough to tell a clear story. So when a body like Tiktaalik appears, with important bones preserved, it is like a lamp being lit in a very long corridor of time. Imagine that corridor stretching across hundreds of millions of years. At one end are lobe-finned fish living in water. At the other end are early four-limbed animals, with limbs bearing digits, able to move through a different kind of environment. Between those ends is not an empty gap, but many forms of life, many bodies, many experiments. Tiktaalik is one of the lights shining in the middle of that corridor. It does not illuminate everything, but it is enough to show us that the path was real, and that living bodies moved through it by means of very specific, very physical changes, recorded in bone. There is a strange feeling in thinking that the familiar parts of our own bodies have such a deep history. A neck that helps us turn our head in the night. A wrist that helps us place a hand on a pillow. Hold a book. Touch the surface of a table. A skeleton that helps the body not collapse. to modern human beings. All these things seem almost ordinary. But in the light of Tiktaalik, they are no longer ordinary. They become distant results of countless transformations, not because we come from Tiktaalik in a direct sense, but because Tiktaalik allows us to see a very ancient part of the story that leads to bodies with limbs. Even so, this chapter does not need to turn Tiktaalik into a shadow of humanity. It deserves to be seen as itself, a creature of the Devonian period, suited to its world. Unaware that it was holding clues for the future, it did not live to prepare for us. It did not exist in order to become a symbol in science books. It simply lived, hunted, avoided danger, and used its body in the ways its environment demanded. That very ordinariness makes it beautiful. Evolution does not require intention. Life does not need to know the future in order to change. It only needs each generation to adapt a little to its present. And perhaps that is why, when we look at Tiktaalik's fin, we should not see only an ancient wrist as an appealing headline. We should see a deeper question. What else can an organ born in water begin to do when the environment changes? What additional task can a skeleton take on before its outer form becomes completely different? How can a small movement beneath muddy water become a distant beginning for much larger movements later on? These questions do not need to be answered quickly. They only need to be held, like the very soft sound of water beneath an ancient Devonian sky. By the end of this chapter, Tiktaalik appears more clearly before us. No longer just a name found in Arctic rock, no longer just a famous fossil in the story of evolution. It has taken shape. An ancient fish with a flat head, high-set eyes, scales, fins, gills, a flexible neck, strong ribs, and pectoral fins containing a wrist-like structure, a creature not belonging to mythic imagination. Yet stranger than many things mythology could invent, because it was real. It once lived in water. It once carried that body through ancient currents, and after 375 million years, its bones still whisper to us that walking on land did not begin with feet, but may have begun with a fin capable of support. As we leave this chapter, hold that image in your mind, a fin pressing down into the mud, not like a hand, yet no longer only like a paddle, a body gently bracing itself in shallow water, a head able to rise, turn, and observe the world at the edge of the surface. And in that quietness, there are no drums, no grand moment being announced, no clear boundary between fish and land animal. There is only life, very slowly, learning one more way to survive. In the next chapter, we will move closer to that boundary, where Tiktaalik should not be imagined as a fish crawling onto land, but as a body living in the meeting place between water, mud, and earth. But before we arrive there, let this strange body remain in your imagination a little longer, silent in the shallow waters of the Devonian period, with its ancient fin holding a secret that human beings would only begin to understand hundreds of millions of years later. In our familiar imagination, the story of life stepping onto land is often painted as a very clear scene, an ancient fish lying beneath the water, then one day thrashing its body and crawling onto the shore, leaving the vast ocean behind and opening the age of land animals. That image is powerful, easy to remember, and very fitting for short stories. But if we listen more closely to the ancient rocks, if we look at Tiktaalik not as a simple symbol, but as a real creature that once lived in a real environment, the story becomes slower, softer, and also far more accurate. Tiktaalik should not be imagined as a fish trying to conquer the land. It was not an adventurer leaving the water out of curiosity, nor was it a creature that knew a vast future lay ahead of it. a future where animals with legs would run across grasslands, climb tree trunks, dig burrows, fly through the sky, and eventually include human beings looking back into the past to search for their own origins. Tiktaalik knew none of that. It simply lived in its own present, in a world of shallow, muddy water, where every movement, every ambush, every turn of the body, every time it braced itself against the riverbed, could be tied to survival. Let the scene return slowly, not an open shoreline with great waves and white sand, not a deep, blue, endless ocean. Tiktaalik's world was closer to shallow waters beside rivers, slow channels, wet mudflats, cloudy pools mixed with silt, where the boundary between water and land never stood still. At times, the water rose and covered the banks. At times, it withdrew, leaving warm, shallow pools beneath the sun. At times, the soft mud was deep enough to hide a body. At times, only a thin layer of water remained over the bottom, forcing every creature there to manage itself differently from those swimming freely in deeper water. In such a place, underwater and on land were not two separate worlds, like two rooms with doors opening and closing. They blended into each other. Mud lay beneath the water. Roots touched the mud. Ancient plant stems fell across the current, creating shade, narrow passages, and stagnant pools. Water could cover a patch of ground in the morning, then withdraw again by afternoon. A creature could still be in the water, yet its back might be very close to the air. It might be able to swim in one deeper spot, then only a few body lengths ahead. The bottom would rise and make swimming difficult. It was precisely in these in-between places that the body could no longer live only as it did in deep water, but did not yet need to live like a land animal either. Tiktaalik belonged to that boundary. Its form, with a flat head, high-set eyes, a strong front body, and fins capable of support, suggests a life close to the bottom, in shallow water, where it could lie still, observe, and wait. It did not need to crawl far across dry land for that body to have meaning. Simply living in shallow water was enough to create special challenges. If the water became too shallow, swimming was no longer the perfect way to move. If the bottom was full of obstacles, a soft body drifting in water was no longer flexible enough. If prey lay ahead, the head needed to lift or turn slightly. If mud held part of the body back, the fin had to do more than fan water. Imagine a heavy, humid Devonian afternoon. Light falls onto the murky surface, not clear and transparent, but glimmering with the color of mud. Primitive trunks stand along the edge of the current, not like modern forests filled with high canopies, but enough to make the land feel less empty. Under the water, dark shapes move slowly. A few small fish pass by like dim shadows. Farther away, there may be larger predators in deeper water. And at the water's edge, where the mud is soft and the current weak, Tiktaalik lies almost motionless. Not because the world is peaceful, but because in nature, silence is sometimes a form of hunting. That body did not need to burst forward quickly. It needed to wait for the right moment. Its flat head helped it lie low. Its high-set eyes helped it observe what was above while its body remained near the bottom. Its flexible neck helped the head move without forcing the entire body to turn sharply in cramped water. Its stronger front fins could help it brace itself, lift the front part of the body slightly, or adjust its posture on the muddy floor. Each of these features can first be understood as an advantage in shallow water, not as proof that Tiktaalik was living on land in the full sense. This point is very important, because if we tell it wrongly, We turn evolution into a story with too clear a goal. We might imagine that everything in Tiktaalik existed to prepare for later animals. But living things do not evolve for a distant future. A structure must be useful in the present, or at least not too harmful, for it to have a chance of being preserved through generations. Tiktaalik's strong fin did not appear because one day animals would have legs. It may have appeared because in shallow water, a fin capable of bracing, pushing, turning, and holding the body was extremely useful. Its flexible neck did not appear so human beings could one day turn their heads. It may have been useful because a predator lying in shallow water needed to aim its mouth and eyes more effectively. So when we say Tiktaalik was learning to live at the boundary, we do not mean that it was consciously learning like a human being. We mean that its body reflected the pressures of an unstable environment. Shallow water does not forgive clumsiness. A creature there had to face changing water levels, slippery mud, divided currents, prey hiding in narrow spaces, and the danger of being trapped in shallow pools. It had to make use of space near the shore without completely leaving the water. It had to live in between, and it was precisely that in-between condition that created special evolutionary opportunities. Look at a shallow pool after the water has withdrawn. To modern human eyes, it may seem like nothing more than a quiet, wet patch of mud, hardly worth noticing, but to a devonian creature, it could be an entire small world. In that pool, there was prey, shelter, light, warmth, and fewer large predators than in deeper channels. But there was danger as well. If the water withdrew too quickly, the body could be trapped. If oxygen in the water decreased, breathing became harder. If the mud was too thick, movement became heavy. In a place like that, any body that could endure a little more, brace itself a little more, and turn a little better, had an advantage. Perhaps Tiktaalik did not crawl long distances across the shore in the way many people imagine, but it may have braced itself underwater. It may have used its front fins to lift its head or the front part of its body in shallow areas. It may have moved slowly across muddy riverbeds, not by walking, but through a combination of thrashing, pushing, bracing, and sliding through the water. Those movements were not grand. They did not look like a majestic creature emerging from the sea before the dawn, but they were more real. And sometimes, what is real in natural history is beautiful, precisely because it does not need dramatization. In life, great revolutions often begin with small behaviors: a head lifting a little higher, a fin pressing into the mud a little longer, a body keeping its balance better in shallow water, a predator able to ambush at the water's edge instead of hunting only in deeper areas. These behaviors, repeated through countless individuals in countless generations, can create a path toward larger transformations. But at the time Tiktaalik was alive, there was no guarantee that such a path would lead to land animals. It was simply a way of life, in a specific environment, with very immediate needs. The water's edge is also a place where many worlds meet. From the deeper water come other fish, competitors, predators, and smaller prey. From the shore come plants, mud, decaying branches, wet patches of ground, and perhaps even invertebrates already living on land or near the banks. That place is not clean, not stable, not neatly categorized, but for that very reason, it is rich with possibility. A deep river has the rules of a deep river. Dry land has the rules of dry land. But the water's edge is a zone of contact, where old rules are stretched, and living bodies must find ways to adapt. If we place Tiktaalik in that zone of contact, all of its features become easier to understand. The flat head is no longer merely a strange detail. It fits a creature lying low, looking upward, waiting. The high-set eyes are no longer decoration. They fit observation in shallow water. The flexible neck is no longer a mysterious leap toward land. It may have helped with hunting and maneuvering. Strong fins no longer have to be understood immediately as unfinished legs. They may have been tools for support and guidance along the bottom. Tiktaalik does not need to be pulled out of the water in order to become important. It is precisely its life in shallow water that makes it important. This story also helps us avoid a deeper misunderstanding. Evolution is not a ladder climbing upward. Tiktaalik was not inferior to an animal with legs. Nor was it a flawed draft of a land animal. It was a successful creature in its own world. Successful enough to exist as a species, to hunt, to reproduce, and to belong to a specific ecosystem. If we call it intermediate, that is the perspective of human beings looking backward from the present into the past. But in the Devonian River, Tiktaalik was not intermediate to anyone. It was itself. That makes the story more humble. We often want the past to lead directly to us. We want to look at an ancient creature and say, this is our beginning. This is the opening of our body's story. But nature does not write history in a way that serves human beings. Tiktaalik did not live to foreshadow the human hand. It lived because the shallow waters of the Devonian period allowed and demanded such a kind of body. Only later, when we look back, do we recognize that those features lay near a major turning point in the history of vertebrate animals? Imagine an ordinary day in the life of Tiktaalik. Not the day of a great discovery, not the day of an evolutionary turning point, but simply a day of survival. The morning water may be higher, covering the mud flats along the riverbank. Tiktaalik moves slowly in the shallows, its body bending gently, its front fins pushing and maintaining balance. When a small shadow passes in front of it, it lies still for another moment. Then its head moves quickly through the murky water. Later, as the sun rises higher and the water warms, the current may weaken, the mud may become heavier, and that body must find a better position, somewhere with enough water to live, but close enough to the shore to hunt and shelter. There is no heroic music in that scene. There is no moment when a foot touches land. There is only an ancient life continuing to flow. But within that very ordinariness, history is accumulating. Bodies like Tiktaalik show that features related to life on land may have formed piece by piece in very ordinary circumstances of nature. Not a sudden invention, but a chain of adjustments. Not a grand departure from water, but a process of living near the shore long enough for the body to gradually become different. The boundary is also dangerous because it changes constantly. A heavy rain can turn a mud flat into a powerful current. A dry season can divide a river into separate shallow pools. Shallow waters can heat quickly, lose oxygen quickly, or become places where creatures are isolated. In such a world, species accustomed only to stable conditions could struggle, but species that were more flexible, more tolerant of change, and able to exploit more positions within the environment could have more opportunities. Tiktaalik belongs to that story, not because it had left the water, but because it lived in a kind of water that forced the body to begin solving problems closer to those of land. And perhaps this is the truest image for this chapter, not a fish crawling onto the shore, but a body lying in shallow water, bracing itself against the muddy floor, its head slightly raised, its eyes turned toward the light above. It is still surrounded by water. It still belongs to an ancient river. But its body has begun doing things that deep water did not demand in the same way. It is living at the edge of two worlds, where swimming and support, water and mud, hunting and entrapment, Opportunity and danger all flow into one another. Seen this way, Tiktaalik becomes more intimate. Not because it resembles us, but because it shows us that life does not change through grand declarations. It changes by adapting to the place where it stands, or more precisely, where it lies, swims, braces, and maneuvers. A creature does not need to know it is standing at the edge of history. It only needs to live at the edge of its environment. And sometimes, those two edges overlap, the edge of an ancient body of water, and the edge of a new chapter in the history of life. So, if there is one sentence about Tiktaalik to keep from this chapter, perhaps it is not the first fish to crawl onto land. That sentence is too neat, too strong, and too likely to distort the truth. A truer sentence, gentler yet deeper, would be this: Tiktaalik was a creature of the boundary, where the fish body began to carry abilities useful for a world that was shallower, heavier, and closer to land. It did not conquer the land. It lived at the water's edge. And that very edge, across a span of time beyond imagination, became one of the most important places in the story of vertebrate animals. Before there were feet placed upon the ground, before there were clear footprints pressed into dry mud, before a vertebrate creature could truly crawl, step, drag itself forward, or lift its body upon land, there was a very quiet stage taking place in shallow water. It was not the grand moment we might easily imagine, where an ancient creature suddenly left the river and entered a new world. It was much slower, much humbler, and perhaps far more wondrous. Because before feet appeared, life first had to learn something more fundamental: how to lift its own body, even for only a brief moment, amid mud, water, and gravity. In deep water, the body is supported. A fish does not need to think about the full weight of its body pressing down upon bones, joints, and the ground. Water embraces its body, lightening its weight, allowing even thin fins to steer, balance, and push the body through the current. But in shallow water, everything begins to change. When the belly comes close to the mud, when the riverbed rises close beneath the body, when the water is only enough to surround part of the body, the creature is no longer fully supported. It is still in the water, but it has begun to feel a part of the world of land, the weight of itself. Imagine Tiktaalik in a shallow stretch of water at the end of the day. The water is not deep. Light slides through the murky mud, with grains of silt suspended like dust in a very old room. Beneath it, its long body lies low, its belly close to the bottom, its flat head facing forward. It does not swim freely like a fish in deeper water. It cannot simply flick its tail and shoot away through open space. Around it are soft mud, decaying branches, plant roots, a slow current, and narrow passages that make every movement require calculation. In that world, a fin does not only need to push water, it needs to press down, hold, lift, support, and turn the body. That is why Tiktaalik's fin became so important. Not because it was already a hand, not because it already had digits, not because it was used to walk on land like some later animal. It matters because it reveals something between two possibilities: still a fin, but already beginning to perform part of the work of a limb on the outside. That fin still belonged to a creature living in water, but inside, its skeleton already had joints and supporting structures that allowed the body to form new postures. It did not merely glide through water, it could brace itself against the mud. A fin that can brace itself may sound like something small, but in the history of life, Small things like that can open very large doors. Think of the moment when a creature in shallow water needs to raise its head just a little higher. It does not need to leave the water. It does not need to crawl onto shore. It only needs the front of its body to rise in order to look, to open its mouth, to turn its head, or to push itself through a shallow stretch of bottom. If the front fin were only soft and weak, the body would slide back down. But if, inside that fin, there were stronger bones, more flexible joints, and better supporting ability, that creature would have another option. It could lift itself a little, and in nature, a little is sometimes the boundary between survival and disappearance. This changes the story of the first step. Walking does not begin with a complete foot. It begins with the ability to bear weight. A body that wants to move in a place closer to land must know how to distribute its weight. Its front body must be strong enough not to collapse. Its skeleton must be stable enough to hold the body. Its joints must allow movement in a space more complex than deep water. Those elements do not necessarily have to appear all at once. They may enter the story across many generations, each generation preserving changes that are useful in shallow water. And Tiktaalik gives us a glimpse of that very slow assembly process. Here, we should imagine evolution not as a craftsman sitting at a desk with a clear blueprint. There is no drawing that says, today create a fin, tomorrow turn the fin into a leg, then add a foot, then add toes. Evolution is more like a current of water. It follows the terrain already there. It meets obstacles, changes direction, flows around them, wears things down little by little, and over a very long time creates new paths. An old structure can be used for a new purpose. A fin that once helped with swimming can gradually take part in supporting the body. A skeleton once sufficient for life in water can become stronger when the environment demands that the body bear more weight. In Tiktaalik, we can see that idea clearly. Its front fins were not legs, but inside them was an arrangement that allowed people to recognize the foundations of the forelimb. Near the body was a large bone. Farther out were connected bones, and then joints that allowed bending and extension. In familiar language, we might say that this fin had something resembling a shoulder, an elbow, and a wrist at an early level. But we must say this carefully. It was not a human shoulder, not a human elbow, not a human wrist. These were ancient structures within the body of a lobe-finned fish, giving it a special kind of movement in shallow water. And the fin did not work alone. A body that wants to lift its front part needs more than a single point of support. It needs strong enough shoulders. It needs a firm enough torso. It needs ribs and a spine that can support it better than the body of a creature that only swims in deep water. In Tiktaalik, the front part of the body and the skeletal frame show a creature that already had features helping its body become more stable in a shallow environment. Not stable like an animal running across land, but enough for us to understand that the transition did not lie only in the fin. It lay in the entire way the body was organized to face a world that was shallower, closer to mud, and heavier. Let that scene become more concrete. Tiktaalik lies in a shallow channel. The current is weak. A small prey animal passes in front of it, near a cluster of ancient plants drooping down toward the surface. If Tiktaalik could only swim as it did in deeper water, it would have to turn its whole body in that cramped space, but with a more flexible head, a sturdier front body, and fins that could press against the bottom. It could adjust its posture. The fin pushes gently into the mud. The front of the body rises. The head moves. The surface trembles slightly. Mud curls upward into a brown cloud. It all happens within a few seconds. Nothing grand in the eyes of that creature. But in our eyes, after 375 million years, It is a moment filled with meaning. Because there, we see that walking has not yet been born, but the conditions for walking have begun to appear. Walking is not only a matter of having legs, a foot without a weight-bearing skeleton, without shoulders, hips, spine, and coordinated muscles, cannot create a land body. To walk, first one must be able to brace. To brace, first there must be a structure capable of bearing force. To bear force, the body must change greatly from within. So when we look at Tiktaalik, we are not merely looking at a strange fin, we are looking at a body beginning to solve the problem of weight. Weight is a silent problem. It does not roar like a predator. It does not appear like a drought or a rushing current. But it is always present. Every time a creature rises out of the water, even only partly, gravity pulls it down. Every time the water grows shallower, the body feels heavier. Every time the fin presses into the mud, the joints must bear more force in shallow water. That problem repeats itself every day. A creature does not need to come fully onto land to encounter it. It only needs to live where the water is no longer deep enough to lift the whole body, and it has already begun a long negotiation with gravity. Perhaps that is why the phrase, "life was learning to rise in muddy water," sounds like a poetic image, yet beneath it is a very real idea. Not rising on two legs, not standing upright, not standing like a human being, but lifting the front of the body away from the bottom, resisting the downward pull, holding the body in a new posture, even for only a moment. From moments like that, structures capable of bearing weight would matter. Joints that allowed bending support would matter. Stronger ribs would matter. A body that could lean against its environment rather than simply drift within it would matter. What is fascinating is that these changes may have been born for reasons very close to the daily life of Tiktaalik. Hunting better, avoiding water that was too shallow, moving through a messy, muddy bottom, holding position in the current, raising the head to reach prey or air. None of those reasons requires a future on land in order to make sense, but precisely because they made sense in the present, they could be preserved and developed. That is the beauty of evolution. The features that shape tomorrow's world often begin as solutions to today's problems. In the muddy waters of the Devonian, there was no clear boundary between a movement used for swimming and a movement used for walking. A fin could both push water and press against the bottom. A body could both bend with the current and need to be stiffer in order to lift its front part. A head could both remain in the water and turn toward the space above. Tiktaalik lived in that mixed zone, and its body carried that same mixed nature. Not entirely a story of deep water. Not yet a story of dry land, but a story of transition, where the body had to learn new abilities without immediately abandoning the old ones. Imagine a child learning to stand. The child does not stand firmly at first. It braces with its hands, falls, pushes itself up, tries again. Of course, Tiktaalik was not a child, and evolution is not an individual practicing for a few days. But that image helps us feel something important. Before there is steady movement, there must be moments of awkward, experimental, incomplete support in ancient nature. Those experiments did not happen in consciousness. They happened through body shape, through environment, through the survival of each generation. A body that could support itself a little better might gain a little more opportunity, and over a long time. That little difference could accumulate into something much larger. But we should not, because of this, turn Tiktaalik into a creature trying to become something else. It was not an unfinished fish. It was complete in its own way, in its own world. Its fin was not a failed hand. It was a successful fin in a special environment. Its neck was not an unfinished animal neck. It was a solution for life in shallow water. Stronger ribs and a sturdier body were not signs of some distant goal. They were part of a body living better in the conditions it encountered every day. Only when we respect Tiktaalik as a real creature, not merely as a step leading toward us, does the story become truly deep. In that light, the fin capable of support is no longer only a scientific detail. It becomes a symbol of how life changes, not through magical leaps, but through changes that can be used, repeated, and passed on. A fin can do one more thing. A joint can bear one more direction of force. A body can lift a little more in shallow water. And then, millions of years later, when animals with clear limbs appear, we can look back and see that those foundations had been prepared earlier, in bodies still covered in scales, still bearing fins, still living between mud and water. This also makes the Devonian period feel closer to us, distant as it is. The problems of the body are still very concrete: how to keep balance, how not to be pulled down, how to turn in a narrow place, how to lift the head, how to cross a difficult stretch without becoming trapped. Those things do not require complicated language to understand. We can feel them with our own bodies. When we push a hand against the bed to sit up, when we place a foot on the floor, when we lift our head from the pillow, we are using abilities that the distant ancestors of vertebrate animals had to solve long ago. Tiktaalik was not the direct ancestor of each one of us, but it helps us see an ancient part of that problem. Even so, this chapter still belongs to mud and water, not to the human hand. Let Tiktaalik remain where it belongs: a shallow stream, a soft riverbed, a body covered in scales, a fin placed into the mud, not like a foot, but not entirely like a paddle either. It lifts the front of the body for a moment, perhaps only to change direction, perhaps only to ambush, perhaps only to pass over a shallow patch. But that small moment shows us that life had begun to become familiar with a new kind of movement, not only moving through water, but pushing against the surface beneath it. And when we look at that scene for a long time, the story becomes quieter. There is no victory, no declaration that the land has been conquered, no great doorway opening all at once. There is only an ancient creature, on an ordinary day in the Devonian, using its body to live better at the boundary. But beneath that ordinariness, history is changing at the speed of stone, of mud, of rivers, of millions of generations. Before there were feet, life learned how to press down. Before there was walking, life learned how to lift up. Before land belonged to vertebrate animals, a few bodies beneath the water had begun to become familiar with the heaviness of themselves. As this chapter comes to a close, hold on to that image like a slow-motion scene in the dark: shallow Devonian water, the mud surface trembling softly, dim light on the silt, and Tiktaalik bracing its strong fin against the bottom. No one was there to call it a turning point. No one was there to record that moment. But hundreds of millions of years later, from layers of stone, we know that life once had bodies like this, bodies that did not yet have feet, but had already begun to solve the problem of rising. And from that very problem, the story will continue to widen. Because Tiktaalik did not exist alone in history. It belonged to a world of many creatures, many evolutionary branches, many other fossils also lying somewhere between water and land. But before we step toward those other names, let that ancient fin remain in the mind a little longer. A fin that did not walk, a fin that did not grasp, a fin that did not belong to land. But in the quiet, muddy water of 375 million years ago, it had begun to do something that an entire world of animals would later need: to support the body against the weight of the earth. After looking at Tiktaalik for a long time, it is easy to feel as though the entire story of life stepping onto land is contained within a single body, an ancient fish, a fin capable of support, a flexible neck, a moment suspended between water and mud. That story is so powerful that it almost turns itself into a symbol. But if we step back a little, if we allow the frame to widen beyond the shallow waters where Tiktaalik once lived, we will see something deeper, and also something more true. Tiktaalik did not stand alone. It was not a solitary figure in the middle of emptiness. It was not the only bridge connecting fish to four-limbed animals, nor was it a creature placed at the beginning of a straight road, where everything afterward simply moved, step by step, toward human beings. Evolutionary history is not like a line of people following one another across a narrow bridge. It is more like a vast swamp, with many small streams, many branching paths, many channels that dried up, many roots that disappeared, and a few passages that opened farther with time. Tiktaalik is one of the brightest windows into that region. But beyond that window, there are many other shapes moving through the ancient waterlight. Imagine a very wide map of the Devonian period. In one corner, we have seen Tiktaalik in its shallow water world, lying close to the mud, using its front fins to brace itself, carrying within its body signs that foreshadowed a new kind of movement. But if our eyes travel farther across that map, through other rivers, other swamps, other ancient shorelines, we will encounter creatures that were not exactly like Tiktaalik, yet still stood close to the same story. Some species were still very fish-like. Some had moved closer to the form of four-limbed animals. Some are known only from a few pieces of bone. Others are better understood because of nearly complete skeletons. Together, they do not form a neat ladder. They form a dense, branching bush. Before Tiktaalik entered the scientific story, there were other names that had already helped human beings imagine this transition. One of them was Eusthenopteron, an ancient lobe-finned fish often mentioned in the history of research because the skeleton inside its fins had features that led scientists to compare it with the limb structure of four-limbed animals. If we place Eusthenopteron into our imagination, we should still see it as a true fish, belonging to water, swimming in its own world. Yet inside that fin, there were arrangements of bone that allowed people to recognize that the story of forelimbs and hind limbs did not appear out of nothing. Before there were legs, there were fins that carried within them a deeper architecture of bone. Then there was Panderichthys, another creature from the late Devonian, with a long shape, a flattened head, and a body that suggests a life in shallow water. If Tiktaalik draws attention because of its special combination of head, neck, body, and fins, then Panderichthys also helps widen the image of fish that had moved closer to a bottom-dwelling, shore-adjacent way of life, in environments that were no longer like deep water. It reminds us that changes such as a flat head, high-set eyes, and a body suited to shallow water may not have appeared in only one single branch. Perhaps in the shoreline worlds of the Devonian, many different bodies tried similar ways of living, because the environment presented them with similar problems. When we place Tiktaalik beside those names, we begin to understand more clearly why scientists are careful when speaking of direct ancestors in the fossil record. It is very rare to point to one creature and say with certainty, "This is the direct ancestor of everything that came afterward." Ancient stone does not preserve a complete genealogy like a civil registry. It preserves only scattered fragments of life, a skeleton here, a jaw there, a footprint in fossilized mud somewhere else. From those fragments, science reconstructs relationships, compares features, checks the age of rocks, looks at environments, and places each creature into a larger picture. That picture can be powerful, but it is never as simple as a straight line. Tiktaalik, therefore, is more like a close relative in the story than a single confirmed ancestor. It stands near the branch leading toward animals with limbs. But that does not mean every later species came directly from it. There may have been many Tiktaalik-like or Tiktaalik-adjacent species living at the same time. It may be that another branch, not yet found or known only through very limited traces, lay closer to the lineage leading to the first true tetrapods. This does not make Tiktaalik less important. On the contrary, it makes Tiktaalik more truthful. Its value does not lie in having to be the first, but in showing us that a real kind of body once existed in exactly the transitional zone that science had predicted. After Tiktaalik, in that nearby stretch of time, the story begins to move toward creatures with clearer limbs. Among the most famous is Acanthostega. If Tiktaalik still makes us think of a fish with an extraordinary fin, then Acanthostega brings us to a different image, a very early four-limbed animal, with limbs bearing digits, yet still deeply tied to the water. This is what surprises many people. Having digits does not mean it was already good at walking on land. Having limbs does not mean it had already become a full resident of the ground. Acanthostega shows that limbs with digits may have appeared in water before they became powerful tools for life on land. That image is very important, because it reverses a familiar assumption. We often think that legs appeared because animals wanted to walk on land, but fossils such as Acanthostega suggest that some features we associate with land may have developed while creatures were still living largely in water. Toes, limbs, joints, and early supporting structures may have served ways of moving through swamps, through aquatic vegetation, through shallow water, before they were used more effectively on solid ground. In other words, life did not invent legs only after leaving the water. Part of the leg was prepared in the water. Then comes Ichthyostega, another name that often appears alongside Acanthostega in the story of the earliest well-known tetrapods. Ichthyostega had a sturdier body, with features that make people imagine it may have moved across firm surfaces better than Acanthostega. Although it still did not resemble any modern animal completely, if Tiktaalik is a creature at the water's edge with a powerful fin. If Acanthostega shows limbs with digits in a strongly aquatic context, then Ichthyostega brings us to a body that had moved one step further in dealing with weight and movement outside water. But even here, we should not imagine it simply as a modern salamander. These earliest creatures were strange, distinct, and did not fit neatly into the familiar images we carry in our minds. What makes these fossils fascinating is not only each individual name. What is fascinating is that when they are placed beside one another, they give the story depth. Eusthenopteron shows fins with internal bones close to the foundation of limbs. Panderichthys suggests a fish body adapted to shallow water. Tiktaalik gives us a fin capable of support and an especially important front body. Acanthostega shows that limbs with digits could still belong to a very aquatic life. Ichthyostega shows a body that had moved further into the problem of movement on a firm surface. Each creature is a piece of the puzzle. No single piece tells the entire story. But when those pieces are set beside one another, a picture begins to appear. And then there is another kind of evidence, stranger even than bone. Footprints. Bones show us the body. Footprints show us action. A skeleton lies still after death. A footprint is the trace of movement. It is the moment when a body once placed force onto mud, once pushed itself forward, once left the pressure of its body on the ground or on a shallow water bottom. In the story of the origin of four-limbed animals, Ancient footprints in Poland force scientists to look again at the timeline. They appear to be older than Tiktaalik, suggesting that creatures with a tetrapod-like mode of movement may have appeared earlier than some body fossils had once led us to think. This does not destroy the meaning of Tiktaalik. It simply reminds us that body fossils and traces of movement do not always appear in an order that is easy to understand. A footprint may be preserved in a layer of rock, where the body itself was not preserved. A skeleton may be found from a related branch, not from the exact direct ancestral branch. The fossil record is a book with many pages missing. Some pages keep only a torn corner. Some keep the image but lose the words. Some chapters are buried in places no one has yet reached. So when a new discovery appears, the story is not necessarily erased. It is revised, widened, made more complex, and often made more beautiful. Imagine those footprints in an ancient muddy place. The animal is no longer there. There are no bones, no eyes, no skin, no breath. Only depressions remain, held by time. But those depressions say something powerful. A body once placed limbs here. There was once weight. There was once movement. There was once a creature that did not merely drift in water, but used its body and limbs to push itself across a surface. If Tiktaalik lets us see a body capable of support, those footprints let us hear the echo of an action, even though that action faded hundreds of millions of years ago. From here, the evolutionary story is no longer fish became Tiktaalik, and Tiktaalik became four-limbed animals. A truer version is this. In the Devonian period, many groups of closely related creatures lived in shallow water environments, along shorelines, in swamps, tidal flats, or deltas. In those environments, many features related to life on land may have appeared piece by piece. In different branches, some branches vanished, some left fossils, some left only footprints. Some may never have been found at all, and from within that diversity, the lineages leading toward true tetrapods continued farther. If we imagine evolution as a tree, Tiktaalik is not the single trunk leading straight to the top. It is like a branch near the base, very important, very visible, telling us what that tree looked like at a particular moment, nearby. There were other branches. Some stretched out and stopped. Some broke off in the darkness of extinction. Some continued, divided, changed direction, and later led to different groups of animals. When we understand it this way, evolution loses the simplicity of a straight diagram, but gains the truthfulness of a forest. This also helps us tell Tiktaalik's story more fairly. It does not need to be the only one in order to astonish listeners. In truth, a single creature explaining everything would probably be too easy a story. What is more wondrous is that an entire ecosystem, an entire period of time, a whole range of different bodies, all lay within nature's zone of experimentation. Tiktaalik stands out because it was beautifully preserved, because it appeared at an important moment, because its body combined many meaningful features. But around it, before it, and after it, there were other fossils that made the picture wider, deeper, and less like a myth. When we look at these fossils, we also begin to see that science does not stand still. The story of fish moving toward land today is not exactly the same as the story people told a century ago. It changed when Acanthostega became better understood. It changed when Tiktaalik was found. It became more complex again when ancient footprints were published. And it will continue to change if one day, in some distant region of rock, a new fossil comes into the light. That is not the weakness of science. It is its vitality. Science does not hold tightly to a story just because it is beautiful. Science revises the story when stone, bone, and traces begin to speak more clearly. There is a very quiet beauty in that. Imagine paleontologists in many different places around the world, bending down before different layers of rock, searching for the remaining fragments of the same great question. One person sees a fish jaw, another sees a fin, another studies a skull, another measures footprints in stone. Each person holds only a very small part of the past. But when those parts are placed together, the Earth begins to retell a story that no single fossil could ever fully tell. And that story does not merely say that life advanced from water onto land. It says that life tried, it branched, it turned back, it failed, it kept a few solutions, it abandoned countless other possibilities. The bodies of the Devonian period were not standing in line, waiting for their turn to become modern animals. They were living in their own worlds, facing currents, mud, prey, predators, dry seasons, floods, low oxygen, shallows, and depths. From those very specific needs, the great features of animal history gradually appeared. So when we say, the fossils that changed the story of evolution, we are not only saying that they added a few names to a book, they changed the way we imagine the past. They remind us that there was no simple moment called the day fish stepped onto shore. There was no single creature carrying the entire destiny of land upon its back. Instead, there was a long stretch of time, with many different bodies, many different environments, and many different experiments. Tiktaalik is one of the most beautiful pieces of evidence from that stretch of time. But only when we place it among other fossils does its beauty become more accurate. In the soft darkness of tonight's story, imagine all those creatures not as dry specimens in a glass cabinet, but as lives that were once real. Eusthenopteron swimming in ancient water, Panderichthys lying low near the bottom, Tiktaalik bracing itself in the muddy shallows, Acanthostega moving with digit-bearing limbs in a world still full of water, Ichthyostega carrying its heavy body through places where both water and land left their marks. And somewhere, in the ancient mud of a long-lost shoreline, a creature whose bones are no longer left for us still managed to leave behind its footprints. None of them knew they were part of the story of evolution. No creature among them knew that hundreds of millions of years later, human beings would name them, compare them, debate them, reconstruct their bodies, and use them to understand the origin of a world filled with legged animals. They simply lived, but stone preserved a part of that life. And from those very few remaining parts, we learn that the history of life is not a bright, straight line, but a slow maze of adaptation. As this chapter closes, Tiktaalik does not become smaller. It simply becomes less alone. It stands among a cast of ancient characters, each creature carrying its own clue: a fin, a skull, a limb with digits, a footprint, a body suited to shallow water, a skeleton showing how weight began to be handled differently. Each clue is like a faint star in a very distant sky. One star can be beautiful, but only the whole constellation allows us to see the shape. And when we look at that constellation, the question of the journey becomes wider. Not only, what is Tiktaalik? But how did an entire world of creatures at the water's edge open the way for vertebrate animals to enter the land? The answer does not lie in a single name. It lies in many fossils, many traces, many environments, and many attempts made by life. Tiktaalik remains a great light in that story. But around it are other lights as well, helping us recognize that life did not step onto land in one single stride. It reached that place through a vast, complex transitional zone, full of secrets that ancient stone still continues to hold. Aang? after passing through the shallow waters of the Devonian period, after standing before the cold layers of Arctic rock and seeing a strange creature emerge from the past. Let us bring the story very close again. Not back to an ancient river that has vanished, not back to a Devonian mudflat buried deep in stone, but back to your own body, where your hand may be resting quietly beside you, placed on a blanket, resting on a table, or gently relaxed in the darkness as you listen to this story. Try to imagine that hand very slowly. The fingers can curl, stretch, touch one another. The wrist can turn lightly. The arm can rise, press downward, hold a small object, or simply rest against the chest in a quiet moment. These movements are so familiar that we almost never think about them. But beneath that familiarity lies a very long history. A history that did not begin with human beings, did not begin with mammals, did not begin with dinosaurs, and did not begin on dry land. It reaches much deeper, toward ancient bodies that once lived in water, where some features of limbed animals began to appear piece by piece, very slowly, very far away. Here. We need to say this very clearly so the story is not misunderstood. Tiktaalik is not the proven direct ancestor of human beings. We cannot look at a Tiktaalik fossil and draw a simple straight line from it to our own hands. Evolutionary history is not like a single cord stretched tightly from one species to us today. It is more like a larger tree, with many branches, many lost limbs, many paths that left no descendants, and many gaps that fossils never preserved. Tiktaalik is important not because it is our direct ancestor, but because it is a close relative of the transitional zone leading toward animals with limbs. It lets us see a kind of body that once existed near the place where the story from fins to limbs begins to become clearer. So when we say, from the ancient fin to the human hand, we are not speaking of a simple straight line. We are speaking of a deeper, broader, and more careful connection. Tiktaalik is a window. Through that window, we can see that the important features of four-limbed animal bodies did not suddenly appear on land. Part of them had already been prepared in water, in bodies that were still fish, still had scales, still had fins, and still lived among mud, water, and current. Tiktaalik was not the only beginning point, but it is one of the most beautiful pieces of evidence helping us understand that the story of limbs, wrists, shoulders, ribs, and the ability to support the body had very ancient roots. Let us return to that fin one more time. It was not a hand. It did not have fingers opening to grasp. It did not touch the ground like the foot of an animal living on land. On the outside, it was still the fin of a creature living in water, but inside, its skeleton was no longer as simple as a soft paddle. It had bones and joints that allowed that fin to do more than push water. It could brace itself against the mud. It could help the front part of the body rise slightly in shallow water. It could help Tiktaalik maneuver, hold its posture, and live more effectively in its water-edge environment. That is the true importance of its legacy. Not that the human hand comes from Tiktaalik in a direct sense. Rather, Tiktaalik reveals a very ancient stage, when the internal structures inside the fin of a fish had begun to carry abilities that, later, in other evolutionary branches, would become important for animals with limbs. A fin was not yet a hand, but it shows us that the hand did not appear out of nothing. A neck was not yet the neck of a mammal or a human, but it shows us that the separation between head and shoulder has a history. A body living in shallow water was not yet a body walking on land, but it shows us that the problem of supporting weight had begun to be solved very early. If we look at the bones of the modern human arm, we see a very familiar structure, one large bone in the upper arm, two bones in the forearm, then many smaller bones in the wrist, the hand, and the fingers. But that deeper pattern of organization does not belong only to human beings. It appears in many different forms throughout the world of limbed animals. In the wing of a bird, the forelimb has been modified for flight. In the wing of a bat, the fingers are lengthened into a frame that supports the wing membrane. In the leg of a horse, the bones are lengthened and reduced for running fast. In the flipper of a whale, the forelimb becomes a powerful paddle carrying a mammal back into the sea. The same bodily foundation can be reshaped by nature into many different forms, depending on environment, survival pressure, and the separate history of each branch. This helps us look at ourselves with more humility. The human hand is very special to human beings because it allows us to grasp, make tools, write, draw, care for others, build, and touch the world in delicate ways. But it was not the goal toward which all of evolution had been aiming from the beginning. Nature did not create the fins of ancient creatures so that one day there would inevitably be a human hand. There was no distant plan like that. Each creature simply lived in its own world. Each feature was only preserved when it was useful, or at least suitable, within the specific conditions of its own time. Tiktaalik lived for its shallow water world, not for our future. And that is precisely what makes the story more beautiful. Tiktaalik did not need to know that it stood near a great chapter in the history of life. It did not need to know that hundreds of millions of years later, human beings would find its bones in Arctic rock, give it a name, study its fin, and then look back at their own hands with a sense of wonder. It was simply a creature of the Devonian period, living in shallow water, hunting, avoiding danger, bracing its fin against the mud when needed, turning its flat head in murky water, and continuing to exist in its own world. That ordinariness does not make it smaller. On the contrary, it makes it more real. Imagine that scene very slowly. A stretch of shallow water lies beneath the dim light of a Devonian afternoon. Soft mud rests beneath cloudy water. Primitive plants grow along the edge of the current. Small shadows of fish pass by, then vanish into the silt. Tiktaalik lies low near the bottom, its body covered in scales, its eyes turned upward, its broad, flat head almost blending into the color of the water. One front fin presses against the muddy floor, not like a hand, not like a foot, only as a point of support, a small movement, a way for the body to hold its position in a world half water and half land. But within that small movement, we see part of a larger story, life beginning to solve the problem of weight, support, and movement in a shallower environment. From small problems like these, time opens out across an immense distance. After Tiktaalik, or more precisely, after creatures living at the same time and near the same branch as it, clearer forms of limbed animals appeared. Some still lived very much in water. Some moved better along the shore. Some left bones behind. Some left only footprints. Many branches disappeared. Many stories were never preserved by stone. But through the fragments that remain, we see one thing. The process from fin to limb was not a simple leap. It was a long chain of changes, in which bodies both kept what was old and experimented with what was new. Then the land gradually became a larger stage. Early four-limbed animals opened new branches, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and countless extinct groups appeared one after another in the very long history of Earth. The first limbs were modified in many different directions. Some limbs were used to crawl through mud. Some were used to run. Some were used to climb. Some were used to fly. Some returned to water and became paddles. No path was the only path. No form was the absolute ending. Life always uses old material again, revises it piece by piece, and creates new possibilities. In that larger picture, Tiktaalik is like a small lamp lit in a very dark stretch of corridor. It does not illuminate the entire past. It does not answer every question. It does not represent every species that ever lay between fish and four-limbed animals. But its light is enough for us to see important things. We see that a flexible neck could appear in a creature that was still a fish. We see that a fin could have a structure strong enough to brace against the bottom. We see that features related to life on land could form in shallow water environments, before land truly became the home of vertebrate animals. And when we understand that, our hands are no longer only the hands of the present. They become a late part of a very ancient story, not because they are directly connected to Tiktaalik by one single line, but because they belong to the same broad history of limbed animals. Every joint, every movement, every time we press a hand down to sit up, every time we rotate the wrist, reminds us that the living body does not appear in an isolated moment. It is the result of layers of time placed upon one another. It is a living record of lost environments, vanished species, and experiments that succeeded or failed long before human beings existed. Perhaps this is where Tiktaalik becomes most moving. It lets us feel the continuity of life without turning the story into myth. It was not a mystical animal. It was not half fish, half human. It was not proof of a straight ladder leading toward human beings. It was a real creature, belonging to a real age, with real features preserved in stone. And from that truth, our imagination is allowed to travel far. But it travels on firmer ground, the ground of evidence, of bones, of fossils, of anatomical comparison, and of caution. So when we look down at our own hands, we do not need to say, "This is what Tiktaalik's fin became." That sentence is too simple, and it does not match the complexity of evolution. A truer, deeper sentence would be, "This hand belongs to a very long history of limbed animals," and Tiktaalik helps us see one ancient part of that history. Just a small change in wording, but it makes the story far more accurate. It still keeps the wonder. In fact, it becomes even more wondrous, because the truth is no longer forced into an easy straight line. It opens like a forest of many branches, where each fossil is a small path of light in the darkness. Let the final image of Tiktaalik in this chapter not be a fish crawling onto shore, and not an ancestor standing at the front of a line. Let it be a creature lying in its own shallow water, a body covered in scales, with a flat head, high-set eyes, strong fins, a flexible neck, living among mud and water. It did not know it was near a turning point. It did not know that one day people would look at its fin and think of wrists, arms, and hands. It simply lived. But because stone preserved part of that body, we can see within it an ancient question. How could a body born for water begin to have features that helped life move closer to land? The legacy of Tiktaalik lies in that question. It does not lie in turning Tiktaalik into the only answer. It does not lie in calling it the first creature, or a direct ancestor, or the being that single-handedly opened all of land. Its legacy lies in giving shape to a transitional stage that is very difficult to imagine before Tiktaalik. The story might sound like an idea too large to grasp. Fish gradually leading to animals with legs, after Tiktaalik. We can look at one specific body and see the small details of that process. A fin capable of support, a flexible neck, a body suited to shallow water, a creature still fish. yet already carrying clues of a new world. As the night of the story begins to close, hold two images side by side. On one side is the present hand, quiet, familiar, able to move as you wish without needing much thought. On the other side is Tiktaalik's ancient fin, lying in shallow water about 375 million years ago. Not a hand, yet no longer only a simple paddle. Between those two images there is no short straight line. Between them lies an ocean of time, countless evolutionary branches, vanished species, buried layers of stone, and new discoveries that make the story more and more complex. But it is precisely within that complexity that we feel the true beauty of life. Tiktaalik reminds us that the greatest changes do not always begin with loud moments. Sometimes they begin in muddy water, in a fin pressing against the bottom, in a head lifting very low, in a body trying to maneuver better at the edge. Sometimes, history does not walk at the beginning. It braces itself. It rises. It tries. It keeps what is useful. And across a span of time so long that human beings can hardly feel it in full, those small experiments become the foundation for new possibilities. So when we remember Tiktaalik, let us remember it accurately and gently, not as the direct ancestor of human beings, not as the first fish to crawl onto land, but as an ancient creature that helped us see part of the transition from water to land. A fossil showing that before feet existed, before clear steps existed, before the human hand could grasp and write its own history, life already had bodies in shallow water beginning to learn how to support themselves, rise, and live at the edge of two worlds. And in that quietness, the legacy of Tiktaalik still echoes very softly. It echoes in Arctic stone. It echoes in reconstructions of the Devonian period. It echoes in the question of the origin of limbed animals. And perhaps, in a very distant, very indirect way. It also echoes each time we open our hands in the darkness and feel that our bodies do not belong only to the present. They carry a history deeper than memory, deeper than civilization, deeper than any story human beings have ever told. A history that began in water, passed through mud, through stone, through countless vanished creatures, and left within us a quiet feeling that life on Earth is always connected to its own past. And now, as the shallow waters of the Devonian period slowly sink into darkness within our imagination, tonight's journey also gently comes to an end, together. We have returned to a very distant Earth, where the land was still wild and primitive, where vertebrate animals had not yet truly taken possession of the ground, and where a strange creature lay still among mud and water, carrying within its body the small clues of an enormous future. Tiktaalik was not an ancient hero stepping out of the ocean to conquer the world. It did not know that hundreds of millions of years later, creatures with limbs would run, crawl, fly, climb, build nests, hunt, care for their young, and eventually include human beings sitting in the night, looking down at their own hands and wondering where those hands had begun. Tiktaalik simply lived in its own world, in shallow waters, in mud, in the dim light of a very young planet. But that is exactly what makes its story even more beautiful. Evolution does not need loud leaps. Sometimes, the history of life changes through very small things: a stronger fin, a more flexible neck, a body better able to support itself in shallow water. If you have listened all the way to this point, thank you so much for joining me on this ancient journey. Let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? And which moment in the story of Tiktaalik made you the most curious? If you enjoy slow stories about ancient Earth, fossils, prehistoric creatures, and the mysteries of the history of life, please subscribe to the channel, follow the fan page, and suggest the topic you would like to hear in the next episode. I wish you a truly peaceful night, and perhaps, somewhere in your sleep tonight, you may hear, from very far away, the soft sound of Devonian water gently moving around that ancient first fin.